Hey guys, tonight we begin with forgotten hardships of Soviet Union villages. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me no in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. The first thing you might imagine when hearing about life in a Soviet village is a snow-covered scene. Wooden houses, their roofs sagging under heavy white drifts, smoke curling from chimneys, and villagers bundled in layers of wool trudging along narrow, icy paths. It is a picture that feels almost romantic from the outside, but once you step closer, peel back that frosty curtain, the truth emerges. The truth is one of daily hardship, quiet endurance, and struggles woven so tightly into the fabric of everyday life that people often forgot what it meant to live without them. In the late 1920s and 1930s, as the Soviet Union began its enormous experiment in collectivization, villages were thrust into a new kind of existence. Before that, many peasants lived in small, self-sufficient communities, where families tilled their own land, kept chickens and cows, and grew barley, rye, potatoes, and cabbage to feed themselves. Life was not easy, but it was familiar. The rhythms of the seasons dictated the work. Spring brought planting, summer demanded back-breaking labor in the fields. Autumn was a time of anxious harvesting, and winter, though bitter and long, allowed for a brief pause. Collectivization, however, turned this world upside down. Suddenly, the land that families had relied on for generations no longer belonged to them. Fields, animals, even tools were declared state property. Villagers were forced to work together in collective farms known as kolkhozy. For some, this meant joining with neighbors they trusted. For others, it meant standing shoulder to shoulder with rivals, with people they barely spoke to, or with those who resented the entire new system. Overnight, the idea of working to provide for your family alone was gone. Instead, work was for the collective, for the state, and for quotas that seemed impossibly high. Imagine the early mornings in those villages. The cold would seep through the thin walls of the wooden huts, often patched with straw or old rags stuffed into gaps. Families huddled around clay stoves, trying to coax life into smoldering embers before heading to the fields. Children wrapped in whatever scraps of fabric could be spared. Adults pulling on felt boots worn thin over the years, trudging out to start a day's work. The fields were vast, stretching farther than one could see, but the reward was no longer yours to keep. Harvests were tallied, counted, and carted away, while the villagers themselves were left with only a small share, sometimes so little it bordered on starvation. The hardship was not just physical, but deeply psychological. Generations had built their identity around the land, around the pride of a well-tended plot, a good harvest, a barn filled with hay. With collectivization, that pride was replaced by obligation. A man could no longer say, "This is my field." He was now one laborer among many, often working under supervision, always aware that failure to meet quotas could mean punishment not just for himself, but for the whole village. Stories from those years reveal quiet acts of resistance. Some villagers hid grain in secret cellars, concealed beneath floorboards, or buried in the earth behind their homes. Others slaughtered livestock before the state could seize them. But these small rebellions were dangerous. Neighbors, pressed by hunger or fear of retribution, sometimes reported one another. The atmosphere in villages became tense, where trust was fragile, and suspicion hung heavy in the air. And yet, despite this climate of fear and deprivation, life went on. Weddings were still celebrated, though with simpler fare. Songs were still sung, voices carrying across frozen fields in winter nights. Children still played, though their toys were carved from scraps of wood or fashioned from old cloth. Villagers found ways to weave joy into the fabric of hardship, because without it, survival would have been nearly impossible. Daily food was perhaps the most vivid reminder of struggle. Imagine sitting down to a meal in a Soviet village during those years. On the table might be a thin soup, flavored by whatever vegetables could be spared. Perhaps a crust of coarse black bread, so dense and sour it filled the stomach even if it did little to satisfy. If a family was fortunate, there might be potatoes, boiled, mashed, or fried in a shallow pan with a hint of sunflower oil. Meat was rare, often reserved for holidays or special occasions. Milk was precious, and many families stretched it by watering it down, so children might drink a cup that was more cloudy than creamy. Hunger was never far away. Even during periods when harvests were good, much of the produce was requisitioned, leaving little behind. During lean years, hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at stomachs through the long winters. Families shared stories of scavenging for edible roots, boiling nettles into soup, or grinding acorns to stretch flour supplies. Survival required ingenuity, but it also required endurance of a kind that most today can scarcely imagine. The winters themselves were an enemy. Bitter cold that could freeze the very breath from your lips. Wind that sliced across open fields. Snow that piled high against doorways. Families packed into their huts, often just 1 or 2 rooms where life revolved around the stove. The stove was warmth, cooking space, and sometimes even a bed. As children climbed onto the top to sleep where the heat lingered. But wood was scarce, and fires had to be rationed. Families often endured cold nights under layers of blankets and sheepskins, hoping morning would bring sunlight and a little relief. In these cramped huts, privacy was rare. Several generations often lived under one roof, grandparents, parents, children, all sharing the same small space. Every cough, every whispered conversation, every argument echoed through the room. For children, it was a world both comforting and claustrophobic. For adults, it meant constant tension, but also constant reminders of the need to pull together, to endure together. The Soviet government portrayed the villages as the heart of progress, the backbone of the socialist experiment. Posters showed strong men swinging scythes, women smiling as they gathered golden wheat, tractors rolling across fertile fields. Reality was very different. Machinery was scarce, often broken, and work was done with bare hands and aching backs. Promises of modernity clashed with the enduring reliance on wooden plows and simple tools. Still, villagers carried on because there was little choice. To leave was almost impossible. To resist was dangerous. So they endured, day by day, season by season, year by year. And in this endurance lies the forgotten hardship, not the drama of rebellion, but the quiet suffering of ordinary families who asked for little more than bread on the table, warmth in winter, and safety for their children. It is easy, when looking back, to become lost in numbers and policies, collectivization, quotas, production reports. But the real story of Soviet villages is not in numbers. It is in the creak of a door opening to the howling wind. It is in the hollow stomach of a child waiting for a meal that never seems enough. It is in the whispered prayers of a grandmother stoking the fire, hoping the family can make it through another night. These are the details that bring to life the struggles of people who lived in a world far harsher than most of us can comprehend today, and this was only the beginning. For in the decades that followed, the hardships of Soviet village life would deepen, shaped by war, famine, and the endless demands of the state. By the late 1930s, the Soviet countryside had become a paradox. To outsiders, it was described as the proud frontier of the socialist experiment. To those who lived within it, the villages were places where survival was a daily test, and where every small comfort was cherished precisely because life offered so few of them. For many villagers, the changes brought by collectivization and state control did not simply alter the way they worked. It altered the way they thought of themselves. Where once a farmer could speak proudly of his yield, of his herd, of the soil his father and grandfather had worked, now he spoke in whispers, careful not to draw attention, careful not to sound dissatisfied, careful not to give any reason for suspicion. This suspicion lingered everywhere. The 1930s were also years of purges, when loyalty to the state was measured in silence, obedience, and denunciation. Villagers learned to measure their words, to smile when party officials came, to nod during speeches and meetings, even if in their hearts they disagreed. The village meeting halls, often drafty wooden structures with portraits of Lenin and Stalin nailed to the walls, became stages where approval was performed, while real feelings remained locked away behind closed doors at night. Inside the huts, conversations were quieter, but even here, fear crept in. Children were warned not to repeat what their parents said at home. A careless word at school could travel back to the wrong ears. Teachers were expected to instill loyalty, and children sometimes repeated slogans with a fervor that unsettled their own families. The thin line between loyalty and betrayal was blurred and often accidental. Trust was fragile, but life required trust, and so people learned to balance caution with the bonds of kinship and friendship that made life bearable. And yet, even under this weight of fear, the village did not lose its rhythms. Spring still arrived, late and muddy, with its thaw that turned dirt roads into rivers of slush. Men and women trudged out to plant, sometimes with broken tools, sometimes with seeds that were few and precious. Children were sent to chase away birds that threatened to snatch the grain. Summer was filled with long days in the fields, the sun beating down on bent backs, hands blistered from work. Autumn meant the harvest, though so much of it was destined to be carted away by trucks. Winter was still the long enemy, forcing families together in their huts, rationing every scrap of food, every piece of firewood. This cycle of labor and scarcity created a resilience in the villages, but also a deep exhaustion. Generations grew up knowing nothing else, believing that hardship was simply life. A young boy born in 1930 might have known hunger in his earliest memories, worked in the fields as soon as he was strong enough to carry a hoe, and watched his parents age quickly under the strain of endless labor. By the time he was a teenager, the world would plunge into war, and his hardships would multiply. Food remained the ever-present concern. The rationing system was uneven, and villages often received less than towns and cities. Bread was stretched with anything that could be ground into flour, sawdust, bark, potato peels. Soup might be made with a single potato floating in cloudy water. Fat and oil were rare treasures. A piece of meat was enough to make a holiday special, and even then, it was often stringy, tough, or so small it barely flavored the dish. Children learned to eat quickly before portions were taken away. Hunger gnawed at everyone, making tempers short, making bodies weak, making survival itself a kind of achievement. But hardship was not only about food. The lack of medicine was another shadow over village life. A simple infection, something treatable today with a pill, could become a death sentence. Coughs turned into pneumonia. Wounds became festering sores. Mothers lost children to fevers that no herbal tea or folk remedy could cure. The village healer, often an old woman with knowledge passed down through generations, was sometimes the only source of care. She brewed teas from dried herbs, whispered prayers over sick children, and offered whatever wisdom she had. Sometimes it worked. Often it did not. Education, though championed by the state as a triumph, was limited in the countryside. A single teacher might serve an entire village, teaching in a small schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall. Children sat at rough wooden desks, copying Cyrillic letters onto scraps of paper. Lessons were interrupted by farm work, as children were needed in the fields during planting and harvest. Some learned to read and write well. Others grew up with only the most basic literacy, their hands shaped more by tools than pens. Still, education brought glimpses of a wider world. Stories of cities, science, and distant lands that felt almost imaginary to those rooted in the soil of the Soviet countryside. Despite all of this, the villagers nurtured traditions that kept their spirit alive. Folk songs were sung during long evenings, voices blending in melancholy melodies that spoke of love, of nature, of suffering and endurance. Dances were held when there was time and energy, the sound of an accordion filling the air as boots stomped on packed earth floors. Weddings were among the few times when joy seemed to overwhelm hardship, when families gathered to celebrate, even if the feast was meager and the clothing was patched and worn. In these moments, the weight of poverty and fear seemed to lift, replaced by laughter, music, and the stubborn joy of simply being alive. The role of women in these villages was especially heavy. They worked in the fields alongside men, hauled water from wells, tended to children, cooked what little there was, and patched clothing until it could no longer hold together. Many women bore the burdens of absent husbands, some taken by the purges, others sent to labor camps, others gone to war. They became the backbone of survival, holding families together with strength that was often unrecognized by officials but deeply felt within their communities. For children, the hardships of village life shaped every part of their world. They grew up knowing hunger as a constant companion, yet they also found joy in simple things. A carved wooden toy, a game played with stones in the dirt, the excitement of climbing a tree or chasing chickens through the yard. Their laughter echoed against the harshness of reality, proof that even in the grimmest conditions, childhood could find space to exist. And then there were the winters, long, unrelenting, unforgiving. Snow buried the fields, turned roads into impassable paths, and locked families inside their huts. The howling wind rattled shutters, and ice formed along the inside of windows. Nights stretched on endlessly, darkness broken only by the flicker of a single oil lamp or the glow from the stove. Villagers wrapped themselves in layers, shared warmth beneath blankets, and endured. They told stories by firelight, tales of heroes, of ancient battles, of magical creatures Stories that reminded them there was more to life than work and hunger, but always. At the edges of these stories, there was silence. The silence of loss, the silence of hunger, the silence of neighbors who had vanished, families torn apart, lives erased by the demands of the state or the cruelty of fate. This silence became part of the village too, a presence as strong as the fields and the forests. Life in the Soviet villages during these years cannot be captured by numbers alone. It is not only the statistics of famine, the reports of quotas, the speeches of leaders. It is the memory of cracked hands gripping tools in frozen soil. It is the sound of boots crunching over snow as villagers marched to work before dawn. It is the hollow ache of hunger that never truly went away. It is the flicker of laughter, of song, of love that refused to be extinguished. And as the years moved forward, new challenges were waiting on the horizon. For even the hardships of collectivization and scarcity would soon be overshadowed by the devastation of war. The late 1930s brought with them a shadow that would soon darken every corner of the Soviet Union. The looming threat of war. For the villagers, already stretched thin by scarcity, the idea of another conflict was almost unbearable. Many of the older generation remembered the First World War, when sons had marched away and never returned, when hunger had tightened its grip on entire communities. They remembered the chaos of revolution and civil war, when armies swept through fields and homes were taken over by strangers. Now, as whispers spread of tensions in Europe, of Germany under Hitler growing stronger, of alliances and betrayals, the villagers braced themselves for what they feared was coming. In the countryside, news traveled slowly and unevenly. Radios were rare, newspapers scarcer still, and both were tightly controlled by the state. Villagers often gathered in the schoolhouse or collective farm office, where officials read aloud articles from Pravda or other state publications. The words spoke of progress, of strength, of industrial triumphs and agricultural victories. Yet the villagers, their stomachs empty and their fields bare, listened with a quiet skepticism. Reality did not match propaganda, and though they rarely voiced their doubts, the gap between the two gnawed at them by 1939. When the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, the countryside reacted with a mix of confusion and disbelief. How could the country ally, even temporarily, with the very enemy they feared? To the peasants, the politics of Moscow were far away, but the implications were close to home. Rumors spread like fire in the villages, that more young men would be taken, that more food would be seized, that the countryside would again bear the brunt of war. The drafting of young men into the Red Army had already begun. One by one, families watched their sons, brothers, and husbands called away to train, leaving behind women, children, and the elderly to manage the collective fields. Farewells were short and often quiet. There were no promises of quick returns, no guarantees of safety. Villagers hugged one another in silence, tears swallowed as quickly as they fell. For mothers, the ache was unbearable, watching a son walk down the muddy village road, rifle slung over his shoulder, unsure if she would ever see him again. Meanwhile, life in the villages grew harder still. Quotas increased, and with fewer men to work the fields, women carried heavier loads. They rose before dawn, strapped infants to their backs, and trudged out into the fields with tools in hand. Bent over rows of grain, their faces weathered by sun and wind. They labored not only for their own survival, but to meet the demands of the state. Failure to deliver on quotas was not an option. Entire communities could face punishment if targets were missed. Children too were pulled deeper into this labor. Boys, barely into their teens, were handed plows or sent to herd livestock, while girls carried water, weeded rows, and mended torn clothing. Their games were fewer, their laughter less frequent. Childhood was compressed into brief moments between responsibilities, a stolen hour by the river, a quick chase through the village streets before exhaustion pulled them back to duty. As 1941 approached, war was no longer just a rumor. It was a storm on the horizon, creeping closer with every passing day. On June 22nd, when the German invasion began, it was like a blow to the gut of every village. The shock was immense. For years, propaganda had assured them that the Red Army was strong, that the Soviet Union was secure. Yet within days, news of retreats, of bombings, of advancing German forces began to spread. Villagers who had once clung to a fragile stability now found themselves thrust into chaos once again. The war demanded everything from the countryside. Crops, already scarce, were requisitioned in even greater numbers to feed soldiers at the front. Livestock was seized, leaving families with little milk, meat, or hides for clothing. Fields were worked harder than ever, even as the strongest laborers, the men, were gone. Hunger, which had been a constant companion, now deepened into something sharper, more dangerous. People began to starve in greater numbers, yet they pressed on, because there was no alternative. The war also brought fear closer to home. Villages near the western borders were the first to experience occupation. German soldiers marched into towns, seizing homes, food, and property. Families were uprooted, forced to flee deeper into Soviet territory, often on foot, carrying only what they could manage. Those who stayed faced brutality, requisitions, forced labor, violence, and executions. For these villagers, life became a nightmare of survival under foreign boots. Even those far from the front lines felt the war's grip. Bombings struck railways and factories, sending shockwaves through the countryside. Refugees poured into villages, ragged and starving, bringing stories of devastation. Families already living on the edge were forced to share what little they had with strangers, torn between compassion and self-preservation. The bonds of community were tested to their limits. In the midst of this, villagers clung to whatever symbols of resilience they could find. Women embroidered cloth with hidden patterns of hope. Children carved wooden toys from scraps of firewood. Songs, once sung in leisure, now became acts of defiance, carrying verses that reminded them of endurance and survival. Even laughter, scarce as it was, became a kind of rebellion against despair. But the hardest blow of all was the waiting for letters from sons and husbands at the front. The arrival of the postman became both dreaded and longed for. Families gathered, breath held, as names were read. A letter meant hope, even if it was short and censored. No letter meant silence, the kind that grew heavier with every passing day. And then there were the notices, the stark black ink on thin paper, informing a family that their loved one had fallen in battle. These notices tore through villages like storms, leaving grief in their wake. The suffering was immense. But what stands out most in the memory of Soviet villagers during this time is not just the pain, but the endurance. Against every hardship, families found ways to survive. A single loaf of bread was divided into portions so small it seemed impossible, yet it kept everyone alive another day. Neighbors took in orphans, even when they had little for themselves. Women shouldered plows, children hauled water, The elderly chopped wood until their hands bled. Life refused to end, even when everything seemed set against it. As the war dragged on, Soviet villages became both the backbone and the sacrifice of the nation. Their labor fed the soldiers, their endurance kept the home front alive, and their sacrifices measured in hunger, grief, and lives lost carried the weight of the Soviet struggle. And yet, when victory finally came in 1945, it was not triumph alone that filled the countryside. It was exhaustion, an exhaustion so deep it seemed carved into the very soil. The villages had survived, but at a cost so great it could never truly be repaid. Families were shattered, homes destroyed, lives altered beyond recognition. For many, the war years were a blur of hunger, work, and grief, remembered not in grand battles or patriotic speeches, but in the faces of loved ones gone forever. Still, survival itself was a kind of victory, and the story of these forgotten hardships did not end with the war. The decades that followed would bring new struggles, new challenges, and new demands on the villages of the Soviet Union. The war's end in 1945 was supposed to bring relief. Yet for many Soviet villages, it brought only a different kind of struggle. The guns fell silent, the soldiers trickled back home, and banners of victory were waved in Moscow. But the countryside bore scars that no celebration could erase. Entire villages had been reduced to rubble, their wooden homes burned to the ground, their barns looted, their fields left fallow during the years of fighting. When the men returned, those who returned at all, they were greeted not with abundance, but with the raw reality of survival. Families embraced husbands and fathers who looked like strangers, gaunt from years of fighting and starvation, haunted by the memories of war. Children clung shyly to men they could barely recognize, for many had grown up with only vague memories of their fathers' faces. Wives, who had carried the entire burden of work and care for years, now stood shoulder to shoulder with broken men, trying to rebuild homes and lives from ashes. But rebuilding was not simple. The state, triumphant in its victory, demanded more from the countryside than ever before. Industrial recovery in cities was given priority, and much of the countryside was left to struggle on its own. Quotas for grain and livestock remained harsh, even as villages had little seed left to plant and few animals left to breed. Farmers plowed fields with worn-out tools, patched with scraps of metal, and animals so frail they could barely pull carts. One of the most painful sights was the absence of men. Entire generations had been thinned out by war. In some villages, half of the young men had not returned. Streets that once echoed with their laughter and songs now felt eerily silent. Women continued to shoulder the heaviest work, bending over fields, hauling water, chopping wood, while raising children alone. Widows became the quiet backbone of the countryside, their black scarves, a permanent part of village life. And yet, in the midst of this grief and exhaustion, small sparks of renewal appeared. Villagers gathered in groups to rebuild homes from salvaged timber, roofs from leftover sheet metal, chimneys from stones pulled out of ruined barns. Neighbors shared tools and nails, traded seed for flour, and leaned on each other when their strength gave out. Though the state often loomed as a harsh presence, it was the bonds of community that truly allowed survival. The children who had endured hunger and cold during the war were now adolescents, stepping into adult responsibilities almost without transition. They worked long hours in the fields and then trudged to schoolhouses with broken windows and few supplies, learning by candlelight in the winter months. Teachers, often as exhausted as their students, improvised with chalkboards, made from painted planks, and textbooks passed from hand to hand until they fell apart. Education was prized, not only as a duty, but as a faint hope for something better. A future beyond toil and hunger. The returning veterans, though scarred, brought with them both stories of the world beyond and silent determination. Some carried medals pinned to their chests, symbols of bravery. Though in the villages, these medals meant little against the gnaw of hunger and the cold of winter. Still, they wore them proudly on special days, reminders that their sacrifices had not been in vain. Even if daily life offered little reward, hunger did not vanish with peace. In fact, the late 1940s brought another famine, particularly harsh in 1946-47. Crops failed. Rains did not come, and the state still demanded its share. Villagers rationed bread once more, cutting portions into pieces so small that children often licked crumbs from their hands just to savor the taste. Families searched again for wild herbs, mushrooms, and even tree bark to fill empty stomachs. Deaths from starvation returned, quiet and devastating, in the very years that were supposed to mark recovery. Yet, despite these conditions, villages carried on. Weddings were celebrated, though often modestly, with dresses sewn from old curtains and feasts made from potatoes and cabbage. Babies were born, even if mothers feared they had too little milk to nurse them. Songs were sung again, sometimes wistful, sometimes defiant, echoing across the fields as women hoed rows and men repaired barns. These small acts of continuity reminded the villagers that life, fragile though it was, still went forward. Religious traditions, though suppressed by the state, quietly endured. Icons hidden in cupboards were brought out during holidays. Candles lit in memory of the dead, prayers whispered behind closed doors. Elders taught the young the old rituals, not as defiance, but as survival of the spirit. In villages where churches had been torn down or converted into warehouses, faith lived in kitchens, in barns, in the whispers of grandmothers to grandchildren before bed. One of the most profound changes after the war was the way memory itself settled into the village. The names of those who had not returned were recited again and again, etched into the collective heart of the community. Families kept faded photographs propped on shelves, medals tucked into boxes, letters tied with string. Children grew up hearing stories of uncles and fathers they would never meet, their lives woven into the fabric of the village's identity. In this way, the dead lived on, not as ghosts, but as a constant presence shaping the way survivors endured. By the end of the 1940s, the countryside was slowly stabilizing, though stability meant only the ability to continue, not prosperity. Collective farms trudged on, meeting quotas by sheer force of labor, sometimes at the cost of villagers' own survival. Houses, though patched and rough, stood once more. Livestock herds began to recover, though slowly, and fields grew fuller each year. Hunger never disappeared, but it loosened its grip enough for hope to creep back in. For those who lived through these years, the hardships were not forgotten, nor could they be. They were carved into their bodies, their memories, their communities. Even decades later, when children and grandchildren asked about life during those times, villagers would often fall silent, eyes distant, before speaking only in fragments. They would talk of endurance, of helping neighbors, of carrying on, but the deepest wounds, the most painful memories, were often left unspoken. What made survival possible was not simply obedience to the state, nor sheer physical labor, though both were essential. It was resilience, the quiet, stubborn refusal to give up, It was the way mothers shared crusts of bread with their children before eating themselves. The way neighbors helped rebuild barns when one family was too weak to do it alone. The way old songs were sung to remind the young that joy, however fleeting, was still possible. These were the small, everyday acts that built survival out of suffering. And as the 1950s dawned, the Soviet villages, though scarred, stood. The hardships of famine, war, and repression had not destroyed them. Instead, they had forged a kind of endurance that would carry them into yet another era of challenges. The story of these villages, their forgotten hardships, was not one of defeat, but of survival. Survival at an immeasurable cost. Survival that deserves to be remembered, not erased. Life in the Soviet countryside was never only about hunger, labor, or fear. Beneath the weight of quotas and shortages, a quiet, stubborn rhythm of community and culture persisted. Villages did not live only to survive. They lived to remember, to celebrate, and to carry traditions forward, even when the state tried to stamp them out. The village was not simply a collection of houses. It was a living organism, bound together by kinship, memory, and ritual. Every barn, every stove, every well had a role in the shared life of its people. To outsiders, the peasants might have seemed poor, backward, or broken. But within the village itself, there existed a complex world of relationships, habits, and unwritten rules that gave structure to daily life. At the center of this structure were women. While men were officially the heads of households and often held the titles in the collective farm system, it was the women who carried the village on their backs. They rose before dawn, tending to children, cooking what little food was available, gathering water, and then walking to the fields for back-breaking labor. When the day's work on the collective farm was done, they returned home to patch clothes, feed livestock, and keep the household running. Their lives were a seamless chain of obligations, yet they carried them with a quiet dignity that became the bedrock of survival. Grandmothers, in particular, were the keepers of tradition. With the official suppression of religion and the pressure to abandon old customs, it fell to them to whisper prayers, to tell folk tales, to sing the old songs that the authorities disapproved of. Children grew up with stories of mythical creatures who lived in the forests, of saints who performed miracles, of ancestors who endured famine and war. These stories did not simply entertain, they gave meaning to suffering, framing endurance as a legacy that bound the living to the dead. Songs echoed often in the evenings, drifting out of houses and across the quiet fields. A lone voice might start, low and mournful, singing of lost love or hardship, and others would join until the entire room was alive with harmony. These songs were not just art. They were release, a way to express sorrow, longing, and resilience when words alone could not. Marriage rituals, though stripped of much of their former grandeur, still carried deep meaning. Weddings were among the rare occasions when the whole village gathered in joy, even if the feast was meat. A bride might wear a simple white scarf in place of a gown, and a groom might celebrate in his best, often patched shirt. But the laughter, the dancing, and the toasts filled the night with life. Vodka, if it could be found, flowed freely, and tables bent under plates of potatoes, cabbage, and bread. In those moments, the weight of quotas and shortages was forgotten, if only briefly. Births, too, were communal events. Babies were not simply children of one family, but of the village as a whole. Neighbors came with gifts of cloth or food, however small, to welcome new life. Names were carefully chosen, often reflecting family history, with grandparents' names passed down as a way of keeping the dead alive. Though infant mortality remained high, each surviving child was treasured as a victory against the harshness of life, death. On the other hand, was marked with solemn rituals that even the state could not fully suppress. Funerals brought the community together in grief, with villagers carrying the coffin, often handmade, through the muddy streets to the burial ground. Songs of lamentation filled the air, some of them centuries old, their words unchanged despite official disapproval. For a moment, the rules of the state fell away, and only the timeless bond between the living and the dead remained. Social life in Soviet villages was often centered around the collective farm. Yet beyond the labor, there existed informal gatherings that the authorities neither organized nor fully controlled. Neighbors met in kitchens, sharing tea brewed from herbs or vodka when it could be obtained. These gatherings became spaces of both relief and quiet resistance. Stories were told that mocked officials, jokes whispered that would never be repeated outside the safety of trusted walls. Gossip, too, flowed freely: who was lazy, who was hard-working, who had been visited by the secret police. Children found their own world of freedom within the constraints of the village. They roamed fields and forests, climbed haystacks, and waded in rivers during the brief summers. Their play was often rough and unadorned, with toys carved from wood or stitched from scraps of cloth. Yet these games carried echoes of survival. Children played at collective farm, imitating their parents, or at war, mimicking the battles they had heard whispered about. In their laughter, one could hear both innocence and the heavy weight of a history they were too young to understand. The seasons defined life with an iron hand. Spring brought mud so deep that wagons sank to their axles and boots were pulled off in the mire. Summer was a frenzy of labor, with hay to cut, fields to tend, and crops to guard. Autumn brought the harvest, both joyous and fearful, for the state's agents would soon arrive to collect their share. Winter descended like a prison, with snow burying roads, winds howling through cracks in wooden houses, and families huddling around stoves to keep warm. Each season carried its hardships, but also its rituals: spring songs, summer dances, autumn feasts, winter storytelling that gave villagers something to look forward to. The Soviet authorities often spoke of the new Soviet peasant, disciplined, loyal, and productive. But beneath that image lay the old rhythms of village life that the state could never fully erase. Women still baked bread in clay ovens as their grandmothers had. Children still learned to whistle the same melodies. And elders still sat outside on benches, watching the world go by with knowing eyes. The clash between official ideology and lived reality was constant. But in the quiet corners of the countryside, tradition persisted like an underground stream. There was also a darker side to community life, one shaped by fear. Villagers knew that spies, both official and unofficial, might be listening. A careless word against the collective farm system, a joke at the expense of the authorities, even a wistful memory of the pre-Soviet past could bring trouble. Neighbors who seemed close might one day vanish, taken away in the middle of the night. This suspicion eroded trust, yet paradoxically, it also deepened the bonds between those who remained loyal to each other. To be invited into someone's home for tea was not only hospitality, it was an unspoken gesture of trust. The village itself became a symbol of duality, outwardly obedient to the state, inwardly clinging to its own rhythms. The collective farm fields stretched in uniform rows, but in hidden gardens behind cottages. Families grew their private crops of potatoes, carrots, or onions, which often meant the difference between hunger and survival. The official festivals of the state, May Day, Victory Day, Revolution Day, were attended with flags and banners. Yet villagers saved their true joy for weddings, harvest festivals, and the quiet rituals of Easter or Christmas. Celebrated in secret, what held the community together was not ideology, but shared suffering. Everyone had lost someone. Everyone knew hunger. Everyone had endured the cold of winter with too little fuel and the heat of summer with too much labor. This shared burden created a bond stronger than politics, stronger even than fear. In their laughter, their songs, their whispered prayers, villagers carried forward not only themselves, but the memory of those who had come. Before that, this was the world of the Soviet village after the war, a world of paradoxes, where hardship and resilience lived side by side, where the state's shadow loomed large, but never fully smothered the old ways, where survival itself was both a burden and a form of quiet defiance. To understand the reality of Soviet village life, one must look beyond the statistics and the slogans. Numbers tell us how many tons of grain were harvested or how many cows were registered in a cookhouse, but they cannot capture the weight of a mother's sigh when she sees her child hungry, or the sound of an old man's boots crunching across frozen earth before dawn, heading to a day of unpaid labor. It is within these lived details that the true story of hardship and resilience emerges. That the heart of this story were women not as abstract symbols, but as flesh and blood figures who endured more than most. The Second World War had taken countless men from the countryside, leaving widows and orphans behind. Many villagers were left with a ratio of 1 man to every 5 or 6 women. This imbalance meant that the labor of sowing, harvesting, and tending livestock fell increasingly onto female shoulders. A grandmother might lead an ox by its reins, while her daughter hauled buckets of water from the well and her granddaughter dug potatoes from the soil. There was no division of labor that spared the young or the old. Despite this, women created a rhythm of care around their homes. They patched boots with wire, sewed shirts from sacks, and learned to make a meal out of whatever scraps remained after the state took its share. For every loaf of bread officially baked at the Coco's bakery, there was another quietly rising in a clay oven at home, made from flour ground in secret, shared among trusted neighbors. Women became keepers of 2 worlds, the official world of quotas and labor, and the hidden world of family survival. Children, too, carried heavy burdens. A boy of 6 might already know how to herd goats, while a girl scarcely taller than the bucket she carried would make daily trips to fetch water. Play was not absent, but it was interwoven with chores. Wooden toys were carved by fathers or older brothers during the long winters, but even play mirrored reality. Children played at harvest, bending low to mimic the motions of gathering grain, or at soldiers, with sticks for rifles and voices echoing the songs of the Red Army. Education was another paradox. Schools existed in nearly every village, staffed by young teachers sent from the cities. Lessons were filled with slogans, portraits of Lenin and Stalin on the walls, and hymns to the great future of socialism. Yet the reality of village schooling was often bleak. Classrooms were cold, chalk was scarce, and textbooks were shared among 3 or 4 students. Many children arrived hungry, their stomachs growling louder than the recitation of state-approved poetry. Attendance was high in the autumn, but dropped during the spring planting and autumn harvest seasons, when children's hands were needed in the fields. Still, even in this harsh environment, sparks of imagination thrived. A teacher might read Pushkin aloud to a class of tired students, and for a moment the children were transported into worlds of romance and heroism. A girl might scratch her name into the frost on a window pane and dream of one day becoming a doctor or a writer, even though her chances of leaving the village were slim. These small acts of dreaming were themselves a kind of resistance to a system that expected obedience, not imagination. Religious life in Soviet villages persisted in ways both subtle and defiant. Officially, the state declared religion a relic of the past, something that belonged to the dark days before revolution. Churches were closed, their bells silenced, icons removed. Yet in many homes, behind embroidered curtains or tucked away in cupboards, small shrines remained. Mothers lit candles on feast days, grandmothers crossed themselves quietly before meals, and families whispered prayers over their children at night. Easter might be marked with a single painted egg, hidden under bread so that nosy neighbors would not report it. But to the family, it meant continuity with generations past. Resistance took many forms, most of them quiet and nearly invisible. It was in the way a farmer hid a sack of potatoes before the state's inspectors arrived, or in the whispered stories that mocked the absurdities of officials. Laughter itself became a shield, a man who could make others laugh at their shared misfortune was valued as much as the strongest worker in the fields. Humor gave people the strength to endure what otherwise might have crushed them. At times, however, resistance flared more openly. Collective farm meetings were supposed to be unanimous displays of loyalty, but occasionally someone would speak out. A farmer might protest that the quota was impossible, or a mother might demand more grain for her starving children. These voices were often silenced quickly, sometimes harshly, but their echoes lingered. Villagers remembered who had dared to speak, and even if they never mentioned it again aloud, those individuals became quiet heroes in their memory. The environment itself was an ever-present challenge. Winters could stretch for months, with temperatures plunging below -30 degrees Celsius. Families clustered in single rooms, huddling around stoves that burned too quickly through their meager wood supplies. Snow drifted across roads, isolating villagers for weeks at a time. Summer, by contrast, could be scorching, fields filled with dust and insects, leaving workers drenched in sweat as they bent beneath the unrelenting sun. The cycles of nature allowed no rest, and each season brought its own test of endurance. In this setting, traditions tied to nature held even deeper meaning. The first green shoots of spring were greeted with relief and often marked with songs or small rituals passed down through generations. Harvest festivals, though stripped of their former splendor by official disapproval, still brought moments of joy, with villagers sharing what little they had and dancing late into the night. The laughter and music that filled those rare evenings were not simply celebrations, they were acts of survival. Proof that even under repression, the human spirit could find ways to shine. The hidden gardens of the villagers deserve special mention. Officially, the land belonged to the collective, but each family was permitted a small private plot. On these tiny strips of earth, often no larger than a few dozen square meters, villagers poured their care and hope. Potatoes, onions, cabbage, and carrots grew here, carefully tended in the stolen hours after Coco's work. These gardens were the difference between starvation and survival. In winter, cellars filled with jars of pickled vegetables and sacks of potatoes lined the walls. Families guarded these supplies fiercely, for without them the months of snow and cold could prove fatal. Yet even in the face of hunger and exhaustion, pride persisted. Villagers took pride in their skills. A man who could thatch a roof tightly enough to withstand a blizzard. A woman whose hands shaped dough into perfect loaves. A child who could carve a whistle from wood. These skills, humble as they seemed, gave dignity in a world where official recognition was rare. Above all, what marked Soviet village life was endurance. Generations were bound together, not by prosperity, but by survival. A grandmother who had lived through the famine of the 1930s might whisper advice to her granddaughter who now faced shortages in the 1950s. Save every crumb, never waste a scrap of cloth, keep hope alive even when your stomach is empty. These lessons, handed down through whispers, became the true education of village life. What outsiders often missed was the complexity of emotion that filled these villages. Life was not only bleak. There was laughter in the courtyards, warmth in the crowded kitchens, tenderness in the way mothers rocked their babies to sleep. There were stolen moments of beauty, frost glittering on trees at dawn, the scent of fresh hay in summer, the sound of geese returning in spring. These fragments of joy coexisted with hardship, giving people the strength to face another day. Thus, while the Soviet state spoke of progress and collectivism, what truly carried the villages forward were the small, ordinary acts of resilience. The hand that reached out to share a piece of bread, the song that rose in the darkness, the story told by firelight that kept children dreaming of a better world. The Soviet state painted a picture of the countryside that rarely resembled reality. Propaganda posters showed rosy-cheeked peasants smiling as they carried armfuls of grain. Banners proclaiming abundance for all unfurled above collective farm meetings. And official newspapers boasted of record harvests. Yet those who lived in the villages knew that these images were not meant for them. They were crafted for the cities, for the eyes of foreign visitors, and for the leaders in Moscow who preferred illusion to truth. In many villages, the gap between propaganda and reality was almost comical. An agitator might arrive from the district center, unfurl a brightly colored poster of overflowing wheat fields, and lecture about the successes of collectivization, even as the villagers sitting before him were hungry and pale, their fields barren from drought. A Coco's chairman might proudly display a tractor sent by the government, only for the machine to sit broken in a shed, lacking fuel or spare parts. The villagers learned to nod and applaud when expected, then return quietly to the business of survival. This duality, the official version of life and the hidden truth, defined existence in the Soviet countryside. Outwardly, villagers attended parades, raised red flags, and chanted slogans. Privately, they cursed the shortages, shared rumors about corruption, and clung to traditions that the state tried to erase. It was a balancing act, a constant negotiation between what had to be shown and what had to be concealed. Memory played a central role in shaping how villagers endured. Older generations carried with them scars from the famine of the 1930s, when collectivization and poor harvests had brought starvation to countless households. Stories of those years were told in hushed tones, often at night, when children sat close to their grandparents by the stove. These stories were not simply warnings, they were lessons. A grandmother might tell her grandchild never to waste a single crumb of bread, recalling how in her youth even a crust was enough to keep someone alive another day. A father might advise his son to always hide a portion of the harvest, no matter how small, because inspectors could not be trusted to leave enough behind. The past was never distant in Soviet villages. It lived alongside the present. Every barn, every field, every crooked fence post held memories of hunger, of fear, and of resilience. The songs sung in the evenings were often older than the revolution itself, carrying echoes of centuries past. Even as the government tried to shape a new Soviet identity, villagers continued to weave their lives around these threads of memory, ensuring that what had been endured before would never be forgotten. One of the most striking aspects of village life was how people adapted language itself. To speak openly was dangerous, but silence could not erase feelings. Villagers developed ways of communicating that conveyed meaning without ever risking exposure. A shrug, a glance, or a carefully chosen word could say everything. People learned to listen between the lines, to interpret whether someone's praise for the government was genuine or hollow. It was a culture of double meanings, where survival depended on knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Despite repression, community ties remained strong. The concept of pomochi, mutual aid, survived even in the harshest years. If a family's barn burned down, neighbors gathered to rebuild it. If someone fell sick during harvest, others took on their work without question. The state may have tried to impose collectivism from above, but true collectivism, the organic, human kind, was born of necessity and compassion. It was not about ideology. It was about survival together. Festivals, too, remained deeply communal. Official celebrations like May Day were paraded with banners and speeches, but villagers often found ways to turn them into genuine gatherings. A marching band might play stirring Soviet anthems, but in the evening, once officials departed, villagers would bring out accordions and violins to play their own songs. Weddings were another anchor of community life, often lasting several days despite shortages. Guests contributed what little they had: a bottle of homemade vodka, a loaf of bread, a chicken roasted in a clay oven. Dancing carried on until dawn, a rare moment of release from daily hardship. Alcohol, however, carried its own weight in village life. Vodka was both medicine and escape, consumed at weddings, funerals, and every gathering in between. For many men, it became a way to endure the endless cycle of labor and shortage. Women often bore the consequences, managing households when their husbands drank away their earnings or fell into despair. Yet even here, there was complexity. Vodka was also a currency of trust. A shared drink could seal an agreement, mend a quarrel, or offer comfort. It was both a poison and a bond. The state tried to intrude into every aspect of rural life, but its reach was not absolute. Inspectors came and went, officials gave speeches and demanded signatures, but once they left, villagers often carried on as before. Hidden economies flourished. Barter systems, secret trade in food or goods, and quiet defiance of regulations. A farmer might report one cow, but secretly keep two. A family might claim they had eaten all their potatoes while keeping a sack hidden beneath the floorboards. These acts of quiet resistance ensured survival, though they also carried the constant risk of betrayal. Fear was ever present. Villagers knew that an ill-spoken word could lead to trouble, that a neighbor's envy might result in a denunciation, that the arrival of a black car at night could mean someone would never return. Yet alongside fear was a deep-seated resilience. People found strength in their ability to endure, in their refusal to let hardship extinguish hope. They might not have spoken of rebellion, but every act of endurance was its own form of defiance. The children who grew up in this world absorbed both the fear and the resilience. They learned to keep secrets at an early age, to know which questions not to ask, to read the expressions of adults and sense when something should remain unspoken. Yet they also absorbed the warmth of shared meals, the joy of running through fields in summer, the pride of helping their families. These children carried forward the legacy of survival, shaping future generations with the lessons of endurance. The Soviet state may have tried to mold its people into a single uniform mass, but the villages revealed the persistence of individuality. Each family, each household had its own rhythms, its own stories, its own acts of resistance. Life was not simply imposed from above. It was lived in kitchens and courtyards, in fields and forests, in laughter and in grief. And so, while the official records may speak only of quotas and production, the true record of Soviet village life exists in these memories and stories. They remind us that even in the harshest of systems, people find ways to endure, to resist, and to preserve the threads of humanity that make survival possible. When you picture life in a Soviet village, it is tempting to imagine only the physical hardships, the cold winters, the empty shelves, the endless labor in the fields. But to truly understand how families survived, you must also look at the invisible threads that bound generations together. These threads were not material possessions, for the villagers had little to pass down in terms of wealth. Instead, what endured was wisdom, memory, and a cultural rhythm that allowed them to withstand the storm of the Soviet years. The elders of the villages were often the keepers of this wisdom. They carried the stories of times before the revolution, when villages were still ruled by local traditions, when farming was carried out according to the rhythm of the seasons, rather than the directives of a central plan. They remembered how grain had once been harvested with songs, how weddings were marked by rituals older than anyone could name, how communities once relied on trust rather than on state quotas. These elders were not always romantic about the past. They knew it had its own struggles and injustices, but their memories offered perspective. To the younger generations, they became living libraries, guardians of a different way of life. Children grew up hearing these stories by the stove in winter, when the wind howled outside and frost etched patterns on the window glass. A grandfather might tell of a time when the village celebrated the harvest with a great feast, when everyone contributed to a communal table that stretched from one end of the street to the other. A grandmother might recall how she survived the famine of the 1930s, her voice steady as she recounted how neighbors shared their last scraps of food. These stories were not meant simply to entertain. They were lessons meant to teach children the importance of endurance, sharing, and carefulness with every crumb. Generational memory often clashed with Soviet propaganda. In school, children were taught that the past was dark and backward, that the revolution had brought light and progress. But at home, whispered conversations painted a more complicated picture. This dual education created a strange tension within children. By day, they repeated slogans about the greatness of the Soviet Union. But by night, they heard tales of hunger, survival, and quiet rebellion. Over time, many learned to navigate these contradictions, holding two truths at once. Practical survival strategies were also passed down. One of the most important lessons was how to make the most of every resource. Nothing was wasted. Old clothing was patched until it could no longer hold a stitch. When a coat finally fell apart, its fabric was reused as rags, its buttons saved in a tin for future use, its stuffing repurposed for pillows. Bones from animals were boiled again and again for broth until they yielded no flavor, and then crushed into powder for use in gardens. Even ash from the stove was used as fertilizer. Children were taught from a young age to see value in everything, no matter how small. The kitchen was the heart of these survival lessons. Women, especially, carried the burden of transforming scarcity into sustenance. Recipes passed down through generations relied on creativity. A handful of potatoes could become a soup thickened with flour. A single egg could be stretched into pancakes for a whole family. When sugar was unavailable, honey or beet syrup was used. Fermentation and preservation were essential skills. Cabbage was pickled. Berries were fermented. Mushrooms were dried and strung together like beads to be stored for winter. These methods were not just practical. They were a testament to resilience, to the ability to stretch meager resources into something sustaining. The garden, too, was central to survival. Though fields were collectivized and strictly controlled, families often kept small private plots behind their homes. These tiny gardens were fiercely protected, for they often meant the difference between hunger and survival. Elders taught children how to plant in rows that made the best use of sunlight, how to save seeds from one season to the next, and how to read the soil for signs of drought or disease. These lessons were not written in books, nor taught in schools. They were passed from hand to hand, whispered between generations, ensuring that knowledge survived even when times were most difficult. Seasonal rhythms shaped village life, and these too were preserved through memory. Spring meant planting, and even in years when tools were scarce or weather unforgiving. Villagers rose with the sun to prepare the soil. Summer meant endless labor in the fields, often under the watchful eyes of Coco's officials. Yet still villagers carved out small joys, swimming in rivers, berry picking in the forest, children chasing each other through fields of tall grass. Autumn was the most intense, a season of harvest, when everything depended on gathering and storing enough to last the long winter. Winter itself was harsh and isolating, but it was also a time of storytelling, of mending, of strengthening family bonds. Elders often described the cycle of the year as a kind of heartbeat, steady and unbroken, guiding the people through whatever hardships the state imposed. Cultural traditions played a role in survival as well. Officially, religion was suppressed in the Soviet Union, but in the villages, faith did not disappear. Churches might be closed, icons hidden, priests silenced, yet families still whispered prayers before meals, still celebrated Easter and Christmas in secret, still baptized their children. Elders ensured that these traditions lived on, often in disguised forms. A gathering that appeared to be a simple family meal might actually mark a holy day. A lullaby sung to a child might contain fragments of ancient hymns. Through these quiet acts, villagers preserved not only their faith, but also their sense of continuity, of belonging to something older and greater than the Soviet system. The resilience of elders was not only spiritual, but also practical. They often played the role of mediators within families, smoothing conflicts between generations. When young people became frustrated with shortages or the restrictions of village life, older relatives reminded them that hardship had always existed in some form, that endurance was not just a burden but a skill. At the same time, elders carried grief. They remembered neighbors lost to famine, relatives taken away during purges, children buried too soon. This grief shaped their outlook, giving them both a deep appreciation for survival and a quiet resignation that life would always demand struggle. For younger villagers, this inheritance of memory was heavy, but it was also empowering. They carried with them both the warnings of the past and the tools to survive the present. They learned not to rely on the promises of the state, but to trust in the lessons of their families. And though they rarely said it aloud, many understood that these lessons would one day help them endure beyond the Soviet system itself. The Soviet government may have sought to erase individuality, but it could not erase memory. It could not stop a grandmother from teaching her granddaughter how to make bread with almost nothing. It could not silence a grandfather who whispered old proverbs by the fire. It could not prevent the passing down of songs, recipes, and survival skills that had been forged over centuries. These fragments of culture were like seeds, hidden deep in the soil, waiting for the day when they could grow again without fear. Thus, life in Soviet villages was not only about enduring the present, but also about carrying the past into the future. Generations became bridges, linking what had been with what might still come. And though hardship defined much of their daily existence, there was a quiet triumph in this continuity. Survival itself became an act of defiance, proof that no matter how powerful the state claimed to be, it could not fully control the hearts and memories of its people. To understand the crushing difficulties of Soviet village life, you must step into the daily grind of labor. The collective farm, or kokos, was not merely a workplace. It was a system that dictated every hour of the day, every task in the field, and, often, every morsel of food that reached the family table. Work was not a choice, nor was it guided by personal initiative. Instead, it was bound by rigid quotas, state orders, and a bureaucracy that rarely understood the true needs of the people. Imagine waking before dawn, when the sky is still grey and the ground glistens with frost. A bell or whistle might call villagers from their homes, urging them into the fields. Men, women, and often even children trudged through mud or snow, their breath rising in visible clouds as they gathered tools that were often broken or worn from years of overuse. Horses and oxen, if available, were thin and exhausted, their ribs visible beneath their hides. In many places, villagers had no machinery at all, despite propaganda that boasted of Soviet industrial progress. Plowing was done with wooden tools, sowing by hand, harvesting with sickles. The kokos demanded results, but it rarely provided the means to achieve them. Fertilizer was scarce, seeds were rationed, and tools were in constant disrepair. Villagers were expected to produce high yields for the state, while simultaneously having less and less to work with. Supervisors, appointed by the government, pushed quotas regardless of weather or soil conditions. When fields dried out under the summer sun, or when rain washed away seedlings, excuses were not accepted. The failure was blamed not on nature, but on the workers themselves, accused of laziness or sabotage. This pressure meant that villagers lived under constant fear. An inspector from the district might arrive unannounced, demanding to see progress in the fields. If crops were not growing fast enough, punishments followed. Sometimes it was the loss of rations, sometimes public humiliation at village meetings, sometimes worse. A worker branded as unproductive or uncooperative risked being reported, which could lead to exile, imprisonment, or even disappearance. The memory of Stalin's purges lingered in every village, where entire families had once been uprooted in the middle of the night. Accused of hoarding grain or resisting collectivization, women bore a particularly heavy burden. While men were often pulled away for construction projects, military service, or seasonal work elsewhere, women remained in the villages to maintain both the household and the collective farm. They labored in the fields from dawn until dusk, then returned home to cook, fetch water, tend to animals, and raise children, their hands cracked from the cold and rough soil. their backs bent from hours of stooping, yet their work was seldom recognized. In official Soviet literature, women were praised as heroines of labor, but in reality, their exhaustion was invisible to the state. Children, too, were drawn into this cycle of labor. Even at a young age, they were expected to herd animals, gather firewood, or carry water. Schooling was mandatory, but in practice, many children missed classes during planting and harvest seasons because their families simply could not spare their help. Teachers, themselves burdened by the system, often turned a blind eye, recognizing that survival took precedence over formal education. For children, the fields became classrooms of endurance, where lessons were learned through calloused hands and empty stomachs. Rather than books, the collective system not only consumed labor, but also robbed villagers of ownership. Fields that had once belonged to families for generations were now state property. Grain, vegetables, and livestock were counted and seized for distribution to cities and the military. What remained for the villagers was often barely enough to survive. Officially, each worker was entitled to a share of the cocoa's harvest, but in reality, deductions for state needs consumed most of the yield. The irony was bitter. Those who grew the food often went hungry themselves. To soften this impossible situation, villagers relied on their small personal plots. A narrow strip of land behind a house or along the edge of the village was cultivated with fierce determination. Here, families grew potatoes, cabbages, onions, carrots, staples that became lifelines. Chickens, goats, and sometimes a single cow were kept, if possible, though feeding them was always a challenge. These private plots were technically tolerated because they boosted food supply, but they also highlighted the failure of collectivization. In many cases, the tiny gardens of villagers produced more reliable food than the vast cocoa fields. Life on the collective farm was not measured in hours, but in quotas. Every worker was assigned tasks, and completion was recorded in labor days rather than wages. These labor days accumulated over time, but they did not guarantee payment. At the end of the year, when the state had taken its share, what remained was divided among the workers according to their labor days. Often, this amounted to little more than a sack of grain, a few potatoes, or scraps of clothing. Money was scarce, and in many villages, it was nearly irrelevant. Survival depended on what could be grown, bartered, or saved. This endless cycle of work and scarcity wore down the spirit, but villagers found ways to endure. Some turned to humor, sharing whispered jokes about the inefficiency of the state. A common saying mocked the system: "They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work." Others found solace in music or song, humming old folk tunes while working in the fields. Songs that reminded them of a life before the cocoas. Evenings were often the only moments of rest. After long days in the fields, families gathered around dim lamps or the glow of a stove. Men smoked cheap tobacco rolled in newspaper, women mended clothing, and children listened as elders spoke. Sometimes neighbors gathered, bringing whatever small food or drink they could share. Despite the exhaustion, these gatherings kept the sense of community alive. Laughter might break through the gloom, if only for a moment. Still, the weight of the state was never far away. Posters plastered on village walls depicted smiling workers, tractors plowing rich fields, slogans promising abundance. Radios broadcast speeches praising the achievements of the collective system. Yet villagers could not reconcile these images with their daily reality of broken tools and empty cupboards. The gap between propaganda and life was a wound that deepened with every passing season in winter. The hardships became even more acute. Work did not stop simply because snow blanketed the land. Men and women trudged into the fields to clear paths, repair barns, or cut wood. Hunger gnawed more sharply during these months, when gardens lay dormant and food supplies dwindled. Families huddled together for warmth, burning whatever scraps of wood or peat they could find. Frostbite and illness were constant threats, yet medical supplies were scarce, and doctors were often stationed far away. Survival became a matter of enduring until spring returned. Through it all, the villagers carried a quiet resilience. They endured because they had no other choice, but also because endurance itself had become ingrained in their lives. Work, no matter how punishing, was woven into the rhythm of existence. The collective farm stripped them of autonomy, but it could not erase the deep bond they shared with the land, nor could it extinguish their instinct to survive against the odds. The story of Soviet village labor is not one of triumph, but neither is it solely one of defeat. It is the story of ordinary people navigating extraordinary pressures, of men and women who worked themselves to exhaustion not for reward, but simply to keep their families alive. It is a story where every furrow in the soil carried both the weight of the state and the stubborn determination of those who refused to give up, even when everything was taken from them. If the daily grind of Soviet village life was defined by labor and scarcity, its atmosphere was defined by fear. Fear crept into every home, lingered in every whispered conversation, and weighed heavily on every villager's conscience. The state was not an abstract idea, far away in Moscow. It was present in the watchful eyes of neighbors, the sudden knock at the door, the unrelenting demand for loyalty. For many villagers, survival meant more than finding enough food. It meant navigating the intricate web of suspicion that defined Soviet society. A casual remark, a sigh of frustration, even a misplaced joke could be interpreted as disloyalty. If overheard, these words could travel quickly, and the consequences were severe. People knew better than to speak openly about their hardships, at least not beyond the trusted walls of family. Yet even within the family circle, caution was necessary. Children, innocent in their honesty, might repeat what they heard at home, in school, or among friends. And once such words reached the ears of an authority, accusations followed. The system relied on this climate of mistrust. Informants were everywhere, sometimes openly, often in secret. A neighbor might denounce another to secure favor with local officials. A co-worker could report a complaint to protect themselves from scrutiny. Villagers lived with the constant awareness that any conversation, any action, could be turned against them. Friendship, once a source of comfort, was shadowed by doubt. Can I trust this person? Will they betray me if it benefits them? This culture of surveillance reached into schools as well. Children were taught songs and slogans glorifying the Soviet state, praising its leaders, and condemning its enemies. They were encouraged to report any suspicious talk from their parents or relatives. A child who spoke proudly of their family's loyalty was celebrated, while one who hesitated to recite the correct slogans risked punishment. It was not unusual for children to betray their own parents without fully understanding the consequences. And stories of such betrayals were held up as examples of true patriotism. The village meetings, too, became stages for both loyalty and fear. At these gatherings, officials or party representatives demanded reports on progress, speeches praising the state, and confessions of mistakes. Sometimes, villagers were singled out, accused of failing to meet quotas or of harboring anti-Soviet thoughts. These accusations might be fabricated, exaggerated, or based on little more than gossip. Yet once spoken publicly, they carried weight, and the accused often had no way to defend themselves. The crowd, aware that silence could be interpreted as complicity, joined in the condemnation. Thus, the cycle of suspicion and fear reinforced itself. Religion, long a central part of village life, was another target of state control. Churches were closed or repurposed into storage halls, community centers, or schools. Priests were arrested, exiled, or forced into silence. Yet faith did not vanish. It retreated into homes, where prayers were whispered at night and icons were hidden in cupboards or behind curtains. Villagers still marked holy days quietly, baking bread or lighting candles in secret. But even here, secrecy was essential. For discovery meant accusations of superstition, backwardness, or disloyalty to the modern Soviet vision. The presence of the secret police loomed like a shadow. Villagers spoke in hushed tones about the NKVD, later the KGB, though they rarely used the names openly. Everyone knew stories of families who had disappeared in the night, taken away for questioning and never seen again. Often, the reasons were unclear. A rumor, a misunderstanding, or perhaps nothing at all. Fear was not simply about what the state did. It was about what it might do, unpredictably, without explanation. This uncertainty kept the villagers in a constant state of tension to the outside world. Soviet propaganda painted a very different picture. Posters showed cheerful workers smiling beside bountiful harvests, red flags waving above fields heavy with wheat. Newspapers printed stories of heroic farmers breaking records, of villagers transformed into models of socialist abundance. Radio broadcasts filled the air with triumphal speeches about progress, equality, and prosperity. Villagers were expected not only to listen, but also to believe, or at least to pretend they did. The dissonance between propaganda and reality was sharp. While posters showed plenty, the shelves in village stores were empty. While speeches celebrated success, families shared crusts of bread. And while leaders praised unity, villagers lived in suspicion of one another in this atmosphere. Silence became a survival tactic. Villagers learned to keep their true feelings hidden, to nod along at meetings, to repeat slogans when required. A smile, a gesture, or a few rehearsed words could be the difference between safety and danger. Many became skilled at presenting a loyal face in public, while keeping their private thoughts tightly sealed. This dual life, the outer mask of obedience and the inner world of doubt, became second nature. Yet fear was not the only force shaping village life. There was also resilience in the ways villagers resisted, quietly and invisibly. A loaf of bread saved from the collective bakery and given to a hungry neighbor. A joke whispered when the official left the room. A song sung in the old style during the quiet of night. These were small acts of defiance, but they kept the spirit of the people alive. Faith, humor, tradition, and shared hardship became forms of silent resistance. Ways to hold on to identity in a system determined to erase it. Despite the risks, stories of courage also existed. Some villagers sheltered those who had fallen out of favor, providing food or hiding places at great personal danger. Others spread forbidden literature, passing it hand to hand, often no more than a scrap of paper with a poem or a banned prayer. These acts rarely changed the larger system, but they preserved a sense of humanity in a world that often sought to strip it away. The climate of fear also affected family life. Parents had to make difficult decisions about how much to share with their children. To protect them, some kept silent, never speaking of the family's struggles or opinions about the state. Others tried to instill caution, teaching their children how to behave in school, what to say, what not to say. Still, accidents happened, and many families suffered because of a child's innocent words. The bonds of trust within families were strained by this constant pressure. Isolation deepened the hardship. Villages, already distant from cities, often felt cut off from the world. News came slowly, filtered through state-controlled channels. Travel was restricted, and opportunities to leave the village were limited. For most villagers, life unfolded within a narrow circle: the home, the fields, the meeting hall. Dreams of a different life, whispered in private, seemed unreachable. This sense of being trapped, unable to escape either physically or socially, added to the despair. And yet, amidst the fear and control, life continued. Babies were born, weddings were celebrated, old traditions resurfaced during holidays. Even in the harshest years, villagers found ways to gather and share moments of joy. Music, stories, and laughter echoed in homes despite the risks. These small, human moments stood as quiet proof that the state could never fully control the inner life of its people. The memory of hardship, however, left deep scars. Those who lived through these times often carried the weight of silence long after. Many never spoke openly about what they endured, even decades later. They had been trained too well to keep secrets, to guard words, to avoid risk. But the stories, passed down in fragments, in whispers, or in cautious conversations, reveal the heavy toll that fear and surveillance took on the hearts of Soviet villagers. The Soviet Union promised equality and prosperity, but in the villages, it delivered hunger, mistrust, and endless labor under watchful eyes. The grand vision of progress became, for ordinary families, a life shaped by silence and fear. And yet, within that silence, the quiet resilience of villagers kept something alive, a spark of humanity that endured even the harshest winters of the Soviet system. While fear and scarcity defined much of Soviet village life, there were also quieter rhythms that kept people grounded. These rhythms were not dictated by Moscow or by party officials, but by the deeper pulse of human life: births, marriages, funerals, harvest celebrations, and the simple act of gathering with family. These events carried forward the traditions of generations, even as the state tried to reshape them into something new. Weddings were among the most important milestones in village life. They were moments when the entire community gathered, no matter how bleak the times. Officially, weddings were stripped of religious elements, replaced with state-approved ceremonies that emphasized equality, progress, and the role of the new Soviet citizen. In practice, however, many families blended old customs with the new. A bride might still wear a simple white scarf, a nod to earlier traditions, or an older relative might quietly bless the couple with a whispered prayer before the ceremony began. Afterward, villagers feasted as best they could, pooling resources to create a celebration. A shared pot of soup, some bread, perhaps a small measure of vodka. These became luxuries, savored in the spirit of joy. For one night at least, the burden of daily hardship was lightened by laughter and music. Funerals were different. They carried with them a weight of sorrow that reflected not just the loss of an individual, but also the precariousness of life itself. Many villagers did not live long under the strains of hard labor, poor nutrition, and limited medical care. Infant mortality remained high, and illnesses that might have been treatable elsewhere often proved fatal in remote villages. Funerals, like weddings, were stripped of much of their religious character by the state. Yet villages continued to weave faith into the rituals quietly. A candle lit by an old woman, a cross carved discreetly into the wood of a coffin. A song hummed beneath the breath. These small gestures of resistance preserved dignity for the departed. Seasonal celebrations also persisted, though often in altered form. Harvest festivals had been central to village life for centuries. Times when communities came together to give thanks for the bounty of the fields. Under the Soviet system, these festivals were repurposed as celebrations of socialist labor. Officials gave speeches, banners were raised, and quotas achieved were praised. Yet beneath the political veneer, villagers still found ways to honor the deeper meaning of the harvest. After the speeches ended, they gathered privately to share what food they could, to sing the old songs, and to mark the turning of the seasons as their ancestors had done. Folk traditions, too, endured. Songs carried memory across generations. They were sung while working in the fields, whispered to children at night, or hummed during long walks home. Some songs were overtly patriotic, demanded by the state, but others were older, passed down quietly. These melodies told stories of love, loss, struggle, and resilience, a hidden archive of the village's true experiences. Stories were another vital thread. Around the fire, in the long winter evenings, elders told tales of past generations, of wars, famines, and struggles that had shaped the village long before the Soviet Union. These stories connected children to a history larger than the official narratives taught in school. Food, though scarce, also became a marker of culture. A loaf of rye bread, a bowl of cabbage soup, potatoes boiled with salt. These were not just meals, but symbols of survival. In some homes, families continued to prepare dishes tied to older traditions, even if the recipes had to be altered due to lack of ingredients. On special days, a grandmother might stretch flour and sugar to bake a small cake, its sweetness a rare delight. These foods, shared among family, carried meaning far beyond their modest ingredients. Despite hardship, acts of kindness shaped the texture of village life. Neighbors helped one another in quiet ways. A farmer might share a portion of his harvest with a family struggling through winter. Women gathered to help a new mother, bringing broth or tending the fire. Children cared for one another while parents worked long hours in the fields. Though the system often pitted villagers against each other through quotas and suspicion, human bonds persisted, weaving a fragile net of support. Education played a complicated role in this dynamic. On one hand, schools were tools of the state, drilling children with ideology, demanding loyalty, and reshaping traditions. On the other hand, they offered literacy, arithmetic, and access to knowledge that could broaden horizons. For many children, the schoolhouse became a place where they first read stories beyond their village, where they learned about worlds far away. Yet the tension remained. Teachers were expected to be both educators and enforcers of ideology, blurring the line between learning and indoctrination. Medical care was similarly done. The state prided itself on bringing doctors and nurses to rural areas, building clinics and offering care where once there had been little. But resources were scarce, medicines were limited, and treatments often fell short. A doctor might diagnose an illness, but have no medicine to prescribe. A clinic might exist, but without heating or electricity in the harsh winters, its usefulness was limited. Villagers appreciated the efforts of medical workers, but they also knew the reality. health remained fragile, and survival often depended more on resilience and luck than on science. Religion, though suppressed, endured as a quiet thread in daily life. Some villagers traveled long distances to attend secret services, hidden in barns, basements, or remote chapels that had escaped closure. Baptisms were conducted in secret, marriages blessed by whispered prayers, funerals marked with quiet rituals. For many, faith was not only about belief in God, but also about holding on to identity, continuity, and meaning in a world that demanded conformity. The clash between official Soviet ideals and village traditions created a strange dual existence. Publicly, villagers marched in parades, carried banners, and spoke the required slogans. Privately, they clung to old songs, whispered prayers, and shared stories that defied the official narrative. It was not open rebellion, but a subtle, enduring resistance, a refusal to let the state define every corner of life. Still, the strain of this double life was heavy. Villagers were constantly forced to calculate what could be said, what could be shown, what must remain hidden. Children were caught between the values taught at home and the ideology pressed upon them at school. Elders, who remembered life before the Soviet Union, felt the weight of loss as traditions slipped away. Yet they took solace in the fragments they managed to preserve. The rhythm of survival continued. Season after season, year after year, each winter tested endurance, each spring brought hope, each harvest balanced relief with the demands of the state. Life in the villages was not dramatic in the way of battles or revolutions, but it was deeply human in its persistence against hardship. And in that persistence lay a quiet form of strength, one that, though rarely celebrated, allowed families and traditions to endure beneath the crushing weight of Soviet control. The Second World War loomed over Soviet villages like a storm that never fully passed. Known to Russians as the Great Patriotic War, it consumed not only cities and battlefields, but also the quiet countryside. Villagers bore an immense share of the suffering, for they were the backbone of the nation's food supply, and their sons were among the first to be sent to the front. When war was declared in 1941, the impact was immediate. Young men were drafted in staggering numbers, leaving behind aging parents, wives, and children to manage the fields. Entire villages emptied of their strongest workers almost overnight. Women, teenagers, and the elderly shouldered the burden of farming, struggling to meet quotas set by the state even as the shadow of war stretched across the land. For many families, the departure of a father, son, or brother was the last time they would see him. The front line moved swiftly across parts of the Soviet Union, swallowing villages in its path. Some communities found themselves under German occupation, facing brutal treatment. Homes were seized, food requisitioned, and villagers forced into labor. Resistance was met with deadly reprisals. Entire villages were burned in acts of terror meant to crush morale. Those not caught under occupation still felt the war's reach in the form of requisitions, shortages, and relentless demands from the state. Life at home became a desperate struggle. Women plowed fields with wooden plows, harnessed to themselves like beasts of burden, because horses and oxen had been taken for military use. Children carried water, gathered firewood, and tended small gardens that supplemented meager rations. Grandparents worked until their bodies gave out, driven by the knowledge that without food, both the family and the nation would falter. Hunger became as much an enemy as the German army. Letters from the front were both lifelines and heartbreaks. Villagers would gather at the post office, waiting for news. A short letter, written in pencil on cheap paper, was treasured, read aloud to neighbors, and kept safe in drawers or tucked under pillows. But just as often, families received the dreaded notification, a terse official statement that a loved one had fallen heroically in battle. Grief hung heavy in these moments, yet life in the village allowed little time to pause. Work in the fields could not wait. Children still needed food, and the war machine demanded more grain. The state glorified the sacrifices of villagers, portraying them as patriotic warriors of labor. But this rhetoric could not conceal the exhaustion and sorrow that consumed daily life. Festivals turned into patriotic rallies. Songs once sung for the harvest were replaced with anthems praising victory and sacrifice. The villagers complied because refusal was dangerous, but their private lives told a different story. Mothers cried quietly at night. Children learned to live without fathers. Families clung to whatever scraps of comfort they could find. As the Red Army pushed back the Germans and victory drew nearer, the devastation of the villages became clearer. Thousands of homes had been destroyed, barns burned, livestock slaughtered. Fields lay in ruin, dotted with unexploded shells or littered with the scars of battle. Survivors faced the daunting task of rebuilding not only their homes, but also their sense of stability. Victory in 1945 was celebrated with parades, speeches, and grand proclamations. But in the villages, celebration was tempered by loss. Almost every family had lost someone, often several loved ones. Women who had spent years working the fields alone were left widows. Children grew up without fathers. Entire generations of men were missing from the countryside, leaving gaps that could never truly be filled. Rebuilding was grueling. The state focused on industrial recovery, often at the expense of the rural population. Grain quotas remained high, even though fields were underplanted and labor was scarce. Villagers, already weary from years of sacrifice, found themselves once again asked to endure for the sake of the nation. Materials for rebuilding homes were scarce. Families lived in half-collapsed cottages or makeshift huts while they slowly gathered timber or bricks to reconstruct what had been lost. Yet in this time of hardship, resilience shone through. Women who had managed farms alone during the war continued to play central roles in village life. Many became the backbone of the community, carrying forward traditions and ensuring survival. Children matured quickly, taking on responsibilities beyond their years. The sense of collective struggle deepened bonds among neighbors, who leaned on one another to fill the gaps left by loss. The scars of the war were not only physical, but also psychological. Veterans who returned often carried deep wounds, both visible and invisible. Some returned disabled, unable to work the fields. Others were haunted by memories they could not share, their silence a heavy presence at family tables. Villagers who had endured occupation lived with trauma, their stories often too painful to recount openly. And yet, life pressed forward. The cycle of the seasons resumed, as it always did. Fields were planted again, children were born, weddings celebrated, funerals mourned. Slowly, villages stitched themselves back together, though never fully healed. The war had reshaped them, leaving a lasting imprint on every family and every field. The legacy of the Great Patriotic War lingered in Soviet villages for decades. Monuments were built in village squares, bearing long lists of names of the fallen. Every year, on Victory Day, villagers gathered to lay flowers, to remember, and to remind themselves that their sacrifices had been part of something larger. But behind the ceremonies lay a quieter truth. The war had left villages poorer, emptier, and scarred in ways no monument could fully capture. For those who survived, resilience became a defining trait. They endured not because life was easy, but because survival was the only choice. Their stories, passed down in fragments, reveal not only the immense hardship of war, but also the extraordinary strength of ordinary people who bore its weight. The end of the Great Patriotic War brought no true peace to the Soviet countryside. Victory was celebrated across the nation. Yet in villages scattered across the steppe and forest, the feeling was bittersweet. Homes lay in ruins, fields were scarred by shell craters, and families were permanently fractured by loss. For the survivors, life did not pause for mourning. Instead, the villagers were thrust into a new era of demands. One where the hardships of war gave way to the relentless grind of rebuilding under Stalin's rule. The Soviet Union emerged from the war with immense industrial ambitions, and the countryside was expected to carry much of the burden. While factories and cities hummed to life and military parades filled Red Square with triumphant energy, the villages faced shortages, exhaustion, and the continued grip of collectivization. The kokos, the collective farm, remained the dominant structure, and quotas set by the state grew even harsher in the aftermath of war. Villagers were ordered to produce grain, meat, and milk at levels that were often impossible, given the depleted labor force and ruined farmland. The state collected its share first, leaving peasants with little to survive on. It was not uncommon for a family to hand over the majority of their harvest, keeping only scraps for themselves. Hunger, which many had hoped would end with the war, lingered stubbornly in the countryside. The years immediately after 1945 were particularly brutal. In many regions, famine once again cast its shadow. Poor harvests, combined with excessive state requisitions, left villagers on the brink of starvation. Families stretched meals with foraged foods, mushrooms, nettles, acorns, and whatever could be ground into flour. Mothers thinned soups until they were little more than water with a few floating grains. Children, their stomachs aching, scavenged along forest edges for berries or roots. Despite these struggles, villagers knew that failing to meet state quotas could mean punishment, imprisonment, or worse, the authorities praised the resilience of the peasantry. But behind the speeches and propaganda, villagers often felt abandoned. While Moscow rebuilt its theaters, schools, and grand boulevards, peasants patched roofs with thatch, lived in drafty huts, and used handmade tools worn to splinters. Roads remained unpaved, electricity rarely reached rural households, and medical care was scarce. Diseases like typhus and tuberculosis spread easily, claiming lives that might have been saved with proper treatment. Yet even within this bleak reality, the rhythms of village life continued. Weddings were celebrated with borrowed instruments and homebrewed spirits. New babies were wrapped in hand-sewn swaddles and baptized in secret by grandmothers who kept old, religious traditions alive despite the state's atheism. Funerals were marked by long processions, neighbors following the coffin through muddy lanes, singing old songs that spoke of endurance and sorrow. The younger generation bore the heaviest load in these years. Many children grew up in households without fathers, and from an early age, they were expected to work in the fields, tend animals, and care for siblings. Schooling was available in theory, but attendance was often irregular. Teachers themselves were undertrained, poorly paid, and sometimes forced to divide their time between lessons and farm labor. Still, education remained a powerful aspiration. Parents, even in the harshest conditions, encouraged their children to study, hoping it might offer them a way out of the endless cycle of poverty. The 1950s brought gradual shifts. Stalin's death in 1953 sparked a cautious hope among villagers that conditions might improve. Under Nikita Khrushchev, some reforms were introduced. Quotas were adjusted, taxes on peasants were reduced, and efforts were made to modernize agriculture with machinery and new farming techniques. Khrushchev championed the Virgin Lands campaign, encouraging young people to move eastward to cultivate vast new tracts of farmland. But for the traditional villages of European Russia and Ukraine, little changed on the ground. While machines were promised, many collective farms still relied on hand labor and outdated tools. Livestock remained scarce. Grain was often carted away before villagers could claim their share, leaving them once again to survive on gardens and foraging. Promises of better living standards were slow to arrive, and disappointment lingered yet. It would be unfair to paint the post-war decades solely in shades of despair. Amid the hardship, small joys and cultural traditions gave life meaning. Festivals marking the seasons continued, though stripped of their religious significance. Villagers gathered for dances, sharing songs that blended folk traditions with patriotic themes. Children played games in dusty lanes, fashioning toys from scraps of wood or fabric. Neighbors supported one another through sickness, hunger, and grief, for community was often the only safety net available. The resilience of the people became a defining feature of village life. Women, who had carried the weight of survival during the war, continued to be central figures. They not only worked the fields, but also preserved cultural traditions, told stories around the hearth, and kept the memory of the fallen alive. Elders passed on wisdom about farming, herbal medicine, and weather patterns. Knowledge that was essential in a world where survival depended so heavily on the land. Religious practice remained officially suppressed, but in secret, faith endured. Grandmothers whispered prayers as they baked bread. Baptisms were performed discreetly in rivers or barns. Icons, hidden behind curtains or in cupboards, were quietly brought out on feast days. Though the Soviet states sought to erase such practices, in villages where traditions were deeply rooted, belief adapted and survived, just as the people did. As the 1960s dawned, the countryside still struggled. The Cold War heightened pressures, and resources were often diverted toward military and industrial projects rather than improving rural life. But villagers continued to endure, planting, harvesting, raising families, and maintaining a way of life that had withstood centuries of upheaval. They bore the weight of a system that demanded much and gave little, yet their perseverance ensured the survival of the Soviet countryside. By the early 1960s, Soviet villages stood at a crossroads between tradition and the state's ambition for progress. Khrushchev, full of energy and determined to reshape the Soviet Union, promised that agricultural reform would finally lift the countryside from its perpetual misery. Yet the promises of tractors, fertilizers, and improved living standards clashed with the stubborn realities of collective farming and the bureaucracy that strangled innovation. The Virgin Lands campaign had drawn many young men and women away from their ancestral homes. Posters showed smiling workers turning wild steppe into fields of golden wheat, and trains carried thousands of volunteers eastward. But for the villagers left behind, the campaign drained their labor force. Families already stretched thin now had even fewer hands to help with planting and harvest. Mothers watched sons leave with a mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing many would not return. For those who stayed, life on the Cocos continued as it always had, with early mornings, back-breaking labor, and meager rewards. One of the most striking features of this period was the persistence of manual labor despite the state's obsession with modernity. Propaganda films showed shiny tractors plowing endless fields, but in many villages, horses and oxen remained essential. Women still bent over in long rows to weed by hand, while children carried buckets of water from rivers to gardens. Tools were patched and repatched, with farmers improvising repairs from wire, scraps of wood, or broken metal parts. The gap between the official narrative of progress and the lived experience of peasants grew wider each year. Housing, too, remained inadequate. In some regions, wooden huts with straw roofs persisted well into the 1960s, vulnerable to fire and bitterly cold in winter. Families crammed into one-room dwellings, sharing space with livestock to conserve heat. The promise of new brick houses or apartments was slow to arrive, and when they did, they were often reserved for collective farm managers or party officials. Ordinary peasants waited years, sometimes decades, to see improvements in their living conditions. Food shortages persisted. Despite the USSR's vast agricultural resources, poor planning and rigid quotas meant that villagers often found themselves hungry. Wheat might be grown in abundance, but much of it was shipped away to cities or exported abroad to showcase Soviet success. Villagers relied heavily on private garden plots, which became their lifeline. These small patches of land allowed families to grow potatoes, cabbage, onions, and beets. Chickens, pigs, and goats were raised quietly, sometimes against regulations, to ensure food on the table. In many cases, these private plots provided more reliable sustenance than the collective farms themselves. Yet, even in hardship, there were moments of hope. Rural electrification campaigns slowly reached deeper into the countryside. By the mid-1960s, many villages finally had access to electricity, transforming daily life. Radios crackled with news and music, bringing the wider world into small huts. Electric lights replaced kerosene lamps, and in time, televisions arrived, though often shared between several households. These changes sparked a cautious optimism. Perhaps the Soviet dream was not entirely unreachable. Schools also expanded, though the quality varied widely. In better-equipped villages, children studied literature, mathematics, and even basic sciences, often in drafty classrooms with chalkboards and worn desks. Teachers, many of them women who had come from towns, lived in modest quarters and were held in deep respect by villagers. They were seen as a bridge to the future, instilling in children the belief that education might free them from the endless cycles of poverty tied to farming. But attendance still suffered during planting and harvest seasons, when every hand was needed in the fields. Khrushchev's fall in 1964 marked another turning point. Leonid Brezhnev ushered in what later came to be called the era of stagnation. For villagers, stagnation meant that their hardships neither dramatically worsened nor significantly improved. The pace of reform slowed, and the promises of rapid transformation gave way to cautious, measured policies. In some respects, this stability brought relief. There were fewer dramatic campaigns demanding sacrifice, yet it also meant that the structural problems of rural life remained unresolved. By the 1970s, the Soviet countryside had a paradoxical quality. On one hand, villagers experienced greater access to consumer goods than ever before. Radios, bicycles, and even washing machines began to appear in households, though often after long waits or through personal connections. On the other hand, infrastructure remained underdeveloped. Roads were muddy tracks in spring and autumn, cutting off villages from nearby towns. Medical facilities were sparse, with poorly stocked clinics and doctors stretched thin across vast regions. Despite these shortcomings, the sense of community remained strong. Villages still celebrated harvest festivals, weddings, and military service send-offs with vigor. Music, both folk and Soviet patriotic songs, filled gatherings. Dances in school halls or open fields offered young people moments of joy and connection. Temporary escapes from the relentless grind of agricultural labor. Evenings around the stove were filled with storytelling, knitting, and the quiet company of family religion. Though officially suppressed, never disappeared. In the 1960s and 1970s, church buildings were often locked or repurposed into storage barns, but villagers continued to practice in private. Easter eggs were dyed in secret, icons were hidden behind curtains, and prayers were whispered before meals. For many, faith was not only a spiritual comfort, but also an act of resistance against a state that demanded loyalty above all else. Women continued to shoulder immense burdens. They balanced long hours in the fields with household duties, raising children and tending gardens. Many became de facto heads of households, especially in families where men left to work in cities or military service. Women's resilience, often taken for granted, became the backbone of rural survival. Yet their contributions were rarely recognized in official Soviet rhetoric, which idealized the collective rather than the individual sacrifices made within families. Children of this generation grew up in a world of contradictions. They recited poems about the greatness of the party while watching their parents struggle to stretch food supplies. They studied science and technology, but often lacked access to the very tools and machines their lessons described. Many dreamed of leaving the village for cities, where opportunities seemed broader, and some succeeded. For those who remained, the cycle of rural hardship continued. The 1970s also saw the rise of quiet disillusionment. Villagers, while outwardly compliant, increasingly voiced skepticism in private conversations. They mocked propaganda slogans that promised abundance, knowing all too well the reality of shortages and queues. They shared whispered jokes about officials in Moscow, though always cautiously for fear of informants. Beneath the surface, the faith in the state's promises was eroding by the late Brezhnev years. The contrast between urban and rural life was sharper than ever. Cities, though plagued by their own shortages, enjoyed more infrastructure, cultural institutions, and opportunities. Villages often felt forgotten, their contributions to feeding the nation unacknowledged and unrewarded. Yet they endured, as they had for centuries, sustained by tradition, family bonds, and the stubborn will to survive. The Soviet countryside of the 1960s and 1970s was a place of contradictions, hardship and resilience, stagnation and small progress, suppression and quiet resistance. Its people, though often overlooked in the grand narratives of Cold War politics, carried within them the memory of generations who had endured famine, war, and relentless demands. Their survival was itself a testament to human endurance. By the 1980s, the Soviet countryside was showing deep signs of strain. Brezhnev's long rule had produced stability of a kind, but it was the stability of a house with crumbling foundations. Villagers knew how to survive shortages, how to bend rules, and how to rely on one another when the system failed them. Yet the sense of stagnation weighed heavily, and the optimism of earlier decades was almost entirely gone. The daily grind had not disappeared. Collective farms, still the backbone of rural life, struggled with inefficiency. Machinery was outdated or broken, and repairs took months because spare parts had to be ordered through bureaucratic channels. Farmers often found themselves waiting helplessly while crops rotted in the fields. It was not uncommon for entire harvests to be lost because transportation failed to arrive on time. Trucks, when they came, were too few, their drivers overworked, and their routes dictated by distant officials. The village might have a surplus of potatoes, but without proper storage or transport, tons would spoil before reaching city markets. This mismatch between effort and reward deepened villagers' disillusionment. They continued to labor, but not with the faith that their sacrifices were building a better future. Instead, they worked because there was no other choice. The Soviet state demanded quotas, and families needed whatever small rations and wages their work provided. Yet beneath the surface, villagers were increasingly turning to informal economies, bartering, black market exchanges, and quietly selling food from their private plots. Private plots had always been the saving grace of rural families. But by the 1980s, they had become essential. It was common for families to dedicate entire weekends to tending their own gardens and livestock, often working harder for themselves than they did for the collective. Markets, though tightly regulated, were filled with vegetables, eggs, and meat from these plots. It was an open secret. While official propaganda praised collective farms, everyone knew the private plots fed the nation more effectively. For women, the burden grew heavier. They often juggled 3 roles, working full-time in the fields, managing households, and tending private plots. Early mornings began with milking cows or feeding chickens, followed by long days laboring on collective farms, and evenings spent cooking, mending clothes, and preserving food. Mothers taught daughters to carry the same load, ensuring the cycle of survival continued. Their strength, though largely invisible in official records, was the quiet foundation of Soviet village life. Young people increasingly saw no future in the villages. With education more widespread and urban life portrayed as glamorous, the exodus of youth accelerated. Those who stayed often did so reluctantly, bound by family obligations or a lack of opportunity. The result was an aging rural population, with older villagers left to shoulder the heaviest labor. Fields and houses became harder to maintain, and many villages began to show signs of decline. Abandoned homes, collapsing barns, and overgrown paths where once children had played. Religious traditions, though still suppressed, quietly persisted. Baptisms were carried out in secret. Weddings included prayers whispered alongside official ceremonies, and Easter celebrations happened behind closed doors. Priests, though scarce, continued their work quietly, often traveling long distances to minister to scattered congregations. For many villagers, faith provided not only comfort but also a sense of continuity with ancestors who had endured equally harsh times. Brezhnev's death in 1982 brought a short period of uncertainty. The leadership changed hands rapidly, with Yuri Andropov and then Konstantin Chernenko following in quick succession. Villagers, watching from afar, felt little impact in their daily lives. Grain still needed to be harvested, families still queued for basic goods, and shortages remained. It was not until Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 that real change began to ripple into the countryside. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring offered hope. For the first time, peasants could speak more openly about their struggles without the same fear of punishment. Newspapers cautiously acknowledged the inefficiencies of collective farming, and officials debated reforms. Some villagers experimented with cooperatives, giving farmers more control over production and distribution. These experiments often showed promise, but they also revealed how deeply entrenched the problems were. Alcoholism, long a hidden problem, was thrust into the spotlight during Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign. In villages, vodka had been both a social ritual and a means of coping with hardship. Weddings, funerals, and harvest festivals were all accompanied by drinking. But so were long winter evenings filled with despair. The sudden crackdown created tension. Some supported it, believing alcohol destroyed families. Others resented it, seeing it as yet another intrusion by the state into their personal lives. Black market alcohol flourished, and villagers brewed their own. Despite risks, as the Soviet Union's economic troubles deepened, shortages became worse. By the late 1980s, villagers faced chronic scarcities, not only of food, but also of clothing, soap, and medicine. Queues stretched endlessly, and villagers often traveled to towns or cities to barter goods. Families became experts at improvisation. Soap was diluted, clothes patched until threadbare, and medicines shared carefully between neighbors. Survival was increasingly dependent on mutual support, as communities pooled resources to endure. Yet alongside hardship, new freedoms emerged. Villagers began to openly question the state, something unthinkable just a decade earlier. Old religious festivals were celebrated more boldly. Local traditions revived, and long-suppressed stories of famine and repression were told aloud. For the older generation, this openness was both liberating and frightening. They remembered too well the punishments of Stalin's time, when careless words could mean exile or death. But for the younger generation, it was exhilarating, a chance to reclaim an identity long buried beneath propaganda. Still, the cracks in the system widened. Collective farms, already fragile, began to collapse as central planning faltered. Payments were delayed or non-existent, machinery broke down and was never repaired, and morale plummeted. Villagers turned increasingly to subsistence farming, relying almost entirely on private plots. Many wondered aloud whether the state had ever truly cared for them, or whether it had always simply demanded their labor while giving little in return. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the Soviet Union itself was on the brink of collapse. For villagers, the signs were everywhere. The government's promises rang hollow. Shortages reached unprecedented levels, and uncertainty about the future grew unbearable. Yet they endured, as they always had. Survival had never depended solely on the state. It had always been rooted in family bonds, shared traditions, and the unbreakable will of people who had learned, generation after generation, to make do with little. When the Soviet Union finally dissolved in 1991, many villagers met the news with a strange mix of relief and anxiety. On the one hand, the oppressive weight of the system was gone, and perhaps freedom lay ahead. On the other, the collapse meant the loss of stability, however flawed, and the arrival of a future no one could predict. Villagers braced themselves once again, knowing that survival, as always, would rest in their own hands. The official collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 was a moment that shook the world. But for many villagers, it arrived not as a thunderclap, but as the confirmation of what they already knew. The system had been unraveling for years. By the time the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin, Villagers across the vast land were already living through scarcity, uncertainty, and a profound sense of instability for decades. The state had been both master and provider. It dictated work, distributed rations, and shaped nearly every aspect of daily life. Suddenly, with the end of the Soviet system, that framework disappeared almost overnight. Collective farms dissolved into chaos. Some were formally reorganized into cooperatives, while others simply fell apart. Tractors and tools, once state-owned, were claimed by individuals, sometimes by those with the most connections rather than those who had worked hardest. Fields lay untended in many areas, as villagers struggled to understand who was responsible for what. The early 1990s were marked by what many described as wild uncertainty. Prices skyrocketed as the ruble lost value, leaving wages worthless within days of being paid. Pensioners, who had once relied on small but steady state pensions, now faced crushing poverty. Old women could be seen at market stalls, selling handfuls of potatoes or jars of pickles, simply to buy bread for the week. Families who had survived war and famine in earlier generations remarked that these years were, in some ways, harder, because the collapse came with confusion, no clear authority, no clear rules. Villages that had long depended on state deliveries now found themselves cut off. Fuel shortages left trucks idle, and medicine all but vanished from rural clinics. Doctors, already stretched thin, had to treat patients with little more than herbal remedies, aspirin, and improvisation. Some villages resorted to old folk medicine, reviving traditions passed down through generations. While these methods sometimes provided comfort, they could not cure the more serious illnesses that now went untreated. Infant mortality rose, and preventable diseases spread. Young people, desperate for opportunity, fled in even greater numbers to cities. Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other urban centers swelled with migrants seeking work. Many never returned. Villages were left hollow, with aging populations struggling to keep up with the labor of farming. Once bustling schools closed due to a lack of children. Wooden houses collapsed into themselves, their roofs caving in, their windows broken. Some entire villages were abandoned, their names fading from maps. Those who stayed behind endured a life that often felt frozen in time. They lived on what they could grow, raise, or barter. Goats, chickens, and small gardens became lifelines. Barter systems flourished. Eggs traded for firewood, flour for a pair of shoes, a sack of potatoes for help repairing a leaking roof. The ruble, unreliable as currency, often mattered less than these exchanges of necessity. Culturally, the collapse opened doors that had long been closed. Religion returned openly to village life, with churches restored, crosses raised, and priests once again welcomed into communities. For many villagers, faith filled the vacuum left by the collapse of ideology. Christmas and Easter were celebrated with renewed vigor, sometimes for the first time in living memory. Older villagers wept at being able to attend services without fear of reprisal. In these religious rituals, they found solace and perhaps even a sense of stability amid the turbulence of the times. Yet, the hardships remained unrelenting. Winters were especially brutal. With fuel scarce and wages often unpaid, villagers cut down trees for firewood. Sometimes illegally, sometimes simply out of desperation. Homes, poorly insulated and crumbling, grew colder than ever. Blankets, old coats, and even newspapers were used to seal windows against the bitter wind. Families huddled together at night, relying on body warmth to get through. Hunger returned to levels unseen since the post-war years. Bread lines reappeared, but this time there was no confident state promising a better tomorrow. For women, the strain was immense. They bore the brunt of making ends meet, stretching meager supplies to feed families, sewing clothes from scraps, and navigating black markets. Many men, unable to cope with the loss of structure and dignity once provided by the Soviet system, fell into despair. Alcoholism surged again, tearing families apart and placing further burdens on mothers and grandmothers to hold households together. Despite everything, it was often women who ensured children were fed and clothed, who maintained what little order remained in village life. Despite the suffering, there was also resilience. Villagers who had survived Stalin's purges, the German invasion, and the hardships of collectivization reminded themselves that they had endured worse. They taught younger generations how to live off the land with almost nothing, how to forage mushrooms, how to preserve cabbage in brine, how to stretch a small sack of flour into weeks of meals. Oral traditions of survival resurfaced, passed down at kitchen tables over dimly lit oil lamps when electricity failed by the mid-1990s. A strange duality defined village life. On the one hand, poverty was rampant, infrastructure collapsing, and hope fragile. On the other hand, a sense of freedom was undeniable. Villagers no longer whispered in fear when criticizing the government. Old songs and folk dances were revived. Weddings once again featured traditional costumes and rituals. For the first time in generations, people could celebrate their culture openly, without fear of official disapproval. This cultural rebirth, though fragile, was a spark of light in otherwise dark times. International aid sometimes trickled into villages, brought by charities or church groups. Packages of flour, sugar, or even powdered milk were received with gratitude. These were lifelines, but also stark reminders that the mighty Soviet Union, which had once proclaimed itself the rival of America, had left its people so destitute that they depended on outside charity to survive. Older villagers felt humiliation alongside relief, their pride bruised by the contrast between past promises and present realities. The late 1990s brought further upheaval with the financial crisis of 1998, when the ruble collapsed yet again. Savings evaporated overnight. Villagers who had clung to a fragile sense of stability were thrown back into uncertainty. Once more, they turned to the land, to each other, and to the same strategies of survival that had carried their ancestors through famines, wars, and repression by the early 2000s. Some stability began to return under new leadership, but the scars of the Soviet collapse remained etched into the fabric of village life. Entire generations had grown up knowing only hardship. The young who had fled to cities rarely returned, leaving behind ghost villages scattered across Russia's vast countryside. For those who stayed, the memory of the Soviet Union lingered, not as nostalgia for a perfect time, but as a complicated mixture of order, oppression, and survival in the end. The story of Soviet villages was not one of triumph or defeat, but of endurance. Through collectivization, through war, through stagnation, through collapse, villages endured. They buried their dead, raised their children, tended their fields, and carried forward traditions that no system could erase. The Soviet Union itself may have crumbled, but the resilience of its villages lived on in songs sung around kitchen tables, in recipes passed down through generations, and in the quiet strength of those who had learned, through endless hardship, how to survive and sow. When we remember the Soviet Union, it is easy to focus on the cities. the leaders, the grand speeches, and the military parades. But the true story lies also in the forgotten villages, in the frostbitten winters, the endless queues, the whispered prayers, and the stubborn will to carry on. For it was in those villages, hidden from the grand stages of history, that the real cost of the Soviet experiment was paid day after day, in the lives of ordinary families who asked for little more than enough bread to eat and enough hope to endure tomorrow.